At my son's wedding, my ex-wife humiliated me in front of 200 guests until her own maid of honor stunned the entire room by asking for my number right there on the spot. 200 guests watched my ex-wife try to give me away like a used couch nobody wanted anymore. Anyone want my ex-husband? Sabrina said, laughing into her champagne. He's single and still thinks he's 25. The room laughed with her. That polite, awkward laugh people give when someone's cruelty is dressed up as a joke. Forks paused over cake. A few heads turned toward table 6 to see how I'd take it. I froze at table 6, the divorced parents' table, placed as far from the head table as the seating chart could manage without looking deliberate, though everyone knew it was. Sabrina, I said quietly, not tonight. Oh, lighten up, Daniel. She waved her glass at me, champagne sloshing near the rim. It's a joke. Everyone loves a joke. Then Isabel, the maid of honor, set down her glass. I'm single too, she said, loud enough for the tables around us to hear. The laughter shifted. Sabrina's smile cracked at the edges, just barely, the way ice cracks before it gives. Give me her number, Isabel said, staring straight at Sabrina. Silence dropped over the ballroom like a curtain. Somewhere near the bar, a fork linked against a plate and sounded like a gunshot. Sabrina's face cycled through confusion, panic, and something closer to humiliation, all in about 3 seconds. She was used to being the one holding the room. She was not used to the room turning on her. You offered her up. I'm accepting, Isabel said, calm as glass, not even raising her voice. He seems like a decent man. So what's his number? I want to explain how we got to that ballroom in Lake Oswego, Oregon, on a Saturday night in June, with 200 people watching a 51-year-old man get auctioned off by his ex-wife at their son's wedding. But first, you should know what happened in the 90 seconds after Isabel spoke, because that was the moment everything I thought I understood about my marriage, my divorce, and the woman I'd loved for 23 years started to come apart at the seams, and it didn't finish coming apart until almost midnight, on a hotel terrace, with a photograph on my phone that changed the shape of the entire night. I met Sabrina Cole in the fall of 1996, in a lecture hall at Portland State University, when we were both 22, and neither of us had any money, and all of it seemed romantic instead of frightening. She was studying elementary education. I was 2 years into a history degree I'd eventually turn into a teaching career at Lincoln High School, where I still work today, 28 years later. Same building, different decade, same chalk dust smell in the hallways even though nobody uses chalk anymore. We got married in August of 1998 in her parents' backyard in Salem, with a rented tent and a borrowed sound system that kept cutting out during the vows. I remember her laughing so hard during the ceremony that the officiant had to stop and wait for her. I remember thinking, this is the sound I want to hear for the rest of my life. For a long time, it was a good marriage. Not perfect. Good. We had Julian in 2002, when Sabrina was 28 and I was 29, in a hospital in Beaverton, with a view of a parking garage that Sabrina used to joke was the worst view money could buy. We bought a small house on Ash Grove Lane 4 years later, a 3-bedroom rambler with a crooked chimney and a backyard big enough for a swing set. I taught. She taught for a while, before switching to school administration when Julian was 7. We built a life that looked from the outside like the kind of life people say they want. Julian used to say, when he was young enough to still say things like this without embarrassment, that our house smelled like pancakes on Saturdays no matter what we were actually cooking, because that was the day we were all home together. No school, no meetings, just the 3 of us and whatever project I was building in the garage that month. I coached his little league team for 4 years, badly, by his own account, but he never missed a practice. Sabrina ran the school carnival every spring for a decade, the kind of volunteer work that ate entire weekends, and that she genuinely loved, back before she started describing volunteer work as something other women did because they didn't have real ambitions of their own. The cracks started small, the way they usually do. Sabrina began complaining, gently at first, about how quiet our life was, about how I never pushed for a department head position, never wanted to move, never wanted to travel further than the coast. She'd say things like, "You've settled into being 50 before you're even 40, and I'd laugh it off because it sounded like a joke and because I genuinely didn't mind the life we had. Somewhere in that stretch, around 2015, Sabrina started attending a leadership seminar series through the district, the kind of professional development weekend that sends people home with a binder full of goal-setting worksheets and a new vocabulary for describing their own dissatisfaction. She came back from the second one talking about vision boards and 5-year growth plans, terms that hadn't existed in our marriage before that spring and that once introduced never really left. I supported it, genuinely, encouraged her to pursue the administration track when she first mentioned it, drove her to weekend certification classes in Salem without complaint. I didn't understand, not then, that the growth she was describing had quietly stopped including me somewhere along the way, that the 5-year plan she'd started sketching in that binder had a version of her life in it that looked less and less like the one we were actually living. By the time Julian turned 15, in 2017, the comments had sharpened. She started using the word settling, like a verdict instead of an observation. My rented apartment dream, back when we talked about someday downsizing and traveling, became, in her mouth, evidence that I lacked ambition. My teaching job, the one I loved, the one that let me coach the debate team and take summers to build model train sets with Julian in the garage, became something she referred to at dinner parties as just teaching, with a small emphasis on just that I heard every single time. I should have paid more attention to the specific incident that, looking back now, was the clearest warning I ignored. In March of 2019, Sabrina took a promotion at the school district that put her in regular contact with Preston Yates, a facilities contractor who did work for 3 districts in the metro area and had, according to everyone who worked with him, a lake house on Lake Oswego and a divorce of his own already behind him. She came home from a work dinner that spring, talking about how refreshing it was to talk to someone who understood ambition. I remember standing at the sink, washing a pan, and feeling something shift in the room that I couldn't name yet. I asked her, half joking, if I should be worried. She laughed and said, "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. He's just interesting to talk to." I let it go. I always let it go. That was, I think now, the entire problem with me during those years. I let things go so consistently that Sabrina eventually stopped bothering to hide them because she'd learned I wouldn't push back hard enough to matter. There was a specific dinner in October of 2020 that I think back on more than any other because it's the one where I could have said something and didn't. Sabrina came home from a district conference in Bend with a new phone case. A small thing, expensive, embossed leather, and when I asked where it came from, she said she'd bought it herself as a treat-yourself purchase after a stressful week. 3 weeks later, I found the actual receipt tucked into a coat pocket while doing laundry from a boutique shop in Bend, paid for in cash, dated the same weekend as the conference, at a price that didn't match anything she'd told me. I never mentioned it. I told myself it was a small lie about a small object, not worth the argument it would start, not worth being the husband who went through his wife's coat pockets looking for evidence of something he didn't actually want to find. Julian was 18 that fall, a senior in high school, applying to colleges, and some part of me decided our house needed to stay calm for his sake more than it needed to stay honest for mine. I think now that decision cost me more than I understood at the time. Sabrina learned, without either of us ever saying it out loud, that I would notice things and say nothing. And once she learned that, the small lies became easier to tell, and eventually stopped feeling like lies to her at all. By 2021, Preston Yates had become Sabrina's boss in every way that counted, even though his title never technically outranked hers. She started working later. She started taking calls in the car with the windows up. She started telling me with a strange, performative patience that I wouldn't understand the pressure of her new role, as if pressure was a language I'd never learned to speak, even though I'd spent 20 years managing 32 teenagers a period, 6 periods a day. By the fall of 2021, the distance between us had become something Julian noticed too, even as a 19-year-old away at Oregon State most of the year. He came home for Thanksgiving that year and asked me, quietly, over dishes, whether everything was okay between his mother and me. I told him we were just going through a rough patch, the kind of vague reassurance parents offer children who are old enough to sense trouble, but young enough to still want to be protected from the details. He didn't push, but I remember the look on his face, a kind of careful, guarded worry that made me wish I'd been more honest with him even then, if not for my own sake, then for his, so he wouldn't be blindsided later by something he'd half suspected all along. That same Thanksgiving, Sabrina spent almost the entire dinner on her phone, texting under the table in a way she thought I hadn't noticed, smiling at her screen in a way she used to smile at me. When I asked her about it afterward in the kitchen, she told me it was just work, a district emergency involving a facilities contract, nothing that concerned me. I remember standing there, drying a serving dish, feeling the particular loneliness of being lied to by someone who no longer thought the lie needed to be a good one, because she'd stopped believing I'd ever call it what it was. I remember the last ordinary weekend before all of it, in early December of 2021, a Saturday we spent replacing a section of fence in the backyard that had rotted through, working side by side for most of the afternoon without saying much, the comfortable kind of quiet that had defined most of our marriage, before it started defining its ending instead. Sabrina made grilled cheese for lunch, the way she used to when Julian was small, and for a few hours it felt like nothing had changed. I think about that Saturday sometimes and wonder if she already knew by then that she was leaving, and if some part of her wanted one more ordinary day before she did. In January of 2022, Sabrina left, not dramatically. She didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't even really argue. She sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where Julian used to do his homework, and told me she'd been unhappy for a long time, and that she needed something I couldn't give her. I asked her directly if there was someone else. She said no. I believed her, mostly because I wanted to, and because I still, even then, couldn't imagine the woman I married doing something that deliberate. The divorce finalized in March of 2023. It was, by most standards, civil. We split the house sale down the middle. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Ash Grove Lane, 4 blocks from the house I used to own, close enough that I still drove past it sometimes without meaning to. Sabrina kept most of our joint savings, including a college and wedding fund we'd built for Julian since he was 10 years old, $400 a month, some months more, that had grown to just over $18,000 by the time of the divorce. She told me she'd keep managing it responsibly, since she was better with spreadsheets than I was, and I signed off on that arrangement without much of a fight, because fighting for money always felt, to me, like admitting the marriage itself had been about money, and I didn't want to believe that. 6 months ago, in December, Preston left her. I heard about it from Julian, who heard it from his mother in a phone call that apparently involved a lot of crying. Sabrina moved in temporarily with her sister Georgia in Salem, and told everyone who would listen a different version of events, that she'd left him, that she was thriving, finally free of a man who'd never really valued her. Georgia, Georgia, who I'd always liked, who used to send Julian birthday cards even after the divorce, told me once, quietly, at Julian's college graduation 2 years earlier, that she'd seen Sabrina's car parked outside the Cascade Properties office on a Sunday when nobody should have been working. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it now constantly. Tonight, at her only son's wedding, surrounded by 200 people who'd known our family for decades, Sabrina needed a punchline to prove her new story was true. She needed everyone in that ballroom to see her as a woman who'd left an unambitious man behind and built something better, even though the something better had just walked out on her 6 months earlier and left her sleeping on her sister's pull-out couch. I was that punchline. Except Isabel Marsh, a 38-year-old nurse practitioner and one of Priya's oldest friends from nursing school, wasn't laughing anymore, and she wasn't going to let the room laugh either. "Isabel, I was joking," Sabrina said, forcing lightness back into her voice, the practiced brightness she used whenever a room stopped cooperating with her. "Was it funny?" Isabel asked. "Because I didn't hear anyone really laughing. I heard you humiliating her at her own son's wedding." The word "her" was a small, deliberate cruelty of its own, and everyone at the surrounding tables heard it land. Sabrina's sister, Georgia, shrank into her chair at the head table, her napkin twisted in her lap. Priya's father, a quiet, careful man named Anil Anand, stared hard at his plate, the way people do when they'd rather be furniture than witnesses. Somebody's grandmother, 3 tables over, clutched her pearls with an audible little gasp that would have been funny in any other context. I stood up. Every head at that table turned toward me. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, loud in the sudden quiet. "Why would I stop her?" I asked Sabrina, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used with a classroom full of sophomores when things threatened to spin out of control. "You offered me publicly. She asked for my number publicly. All I'm doing is deciding whether to give it." "You're embarrassing me," Sabrina hissed, low enough that only the closest tables could hear, though her voice carried anyway. "You've spent 3 years embarrassing me first," I said. "Tonight you just did it in front of 200 witnesses instead of just Julian and me." I gave Isabel my number. She took my hand, not romantically, more like a rescue, and we walked together toward the bar at the edge of the ballroom, away from the dance floor, while Sabrina stood frozen behind us. Georgia fanned her with a napkin, the way you'd fan someone who might actually faint from the shock of losing control of a room she'd spent her whole life learning how to control. The band, mercifully, started playing again. Somebody, probably the wedding planner, cued the DJ to bring the volume up, and conversations slowly filled back in around the edges of what had just happened, the way water fills in around a stone. But everyone at that wedding knew what they'd just watched. You could see it in the careful way people avoided Sabrina's eyes for the rest of the night, and the way a few of them, women mostly, women who'd known both of us for 20 years, gave me small, private nods on their way past, the kind of nod that means I saw that, and I'm glad someone finally said it. Isabel and I talked in a corner near the window, away from the noise, for almost an hour. She told me she'd noticed me all weekend, since the rehearsal dinner on Thursday. The toast I'd given Julian, short and unsentimental and, according to her, the only one that didn't sound like it was written by a wedding website. The way I'd helped an elderly guest, Priya's great aunt, to her seat during the ceremony without anyone asking me to, just because I noticed her struggling with the folding chairs on the grass. "I asked for your number to shut down a bully," Isabel admitted, turning her glass slowly on the bar top. "That part was true, but I'm keeping it because I actually want to know you, not because of what happened in there." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had all night. "That's a strange way to meet someone." "Most good stories start strange," she said. We talked for a while about smaller things after that, the kind of easy conversation that felt almost foreign to me after years of measuring every sentence before it left my mouth. She told me about her work in the cardiac unit at Providence, the particular exhaustion of 12-hour shifts, and the strange intimacy of sitting with strangers during the worst nights of their lives. I told her about teaching, about the debate team, about a kid named Owen I'd coached the previous spring who'd gone from barely speaking in class to placing 3rd at state finals. She laughed at the right moments and asked good follow-up questions, the kind that told me she was actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to talk, a skill I'd forgotten how rare it was until I was sitting across from someone who had it. "Can I ask you something?" she said, turning her glass slowly on the bar top. "And you don't have to answer if it's too personal for a wedding reception. Go ahead." Was any of what she said back there true? The settling thing? I thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. "I loved my life," I said finally, quiet as it was. "I don't think wanting a quiet life is the same as settling. I think she needed it to be settling, so leaving made sense to her." Isabel nodded slowly, like she was filing the answer away somewhere. "That tracks," she said. "People who need a story badly enough will usually find a way to make you the villain in it, so they don't have to be." I didn't know yet, standing at that bar, how precisely she'd described what was still coming. Priya found us there a little later, still glowing in her wedding dress, and hugged Isabel tightly before turning to me with an apologetic look that didn't belong to a bride on her own wedding night. "I'm so sorry about my mother-in-law," she said, and I told her honestly that none of it was her fault or Julian's, that she shouldn't spend a single minute of her wedding worrying about it. She squeezed my hand before the photographer pulled her away for another round of formal photos, and I watched her go, thinking that whatever else had happened that night, Julian had chosen well, had found someone with the kind of steadiness I hoped he'd learned to look for. "She's good for him," Isabel said, watching the same thing I was watching. She is, I agreed. I think he needed someone who says what she means. Runs in the family, apparently, Isabel said, tilting her glass toward me slightly. And I laughed again, surprised at how easy it was starting to feel, laughing on a night that had begun so badly. But Sabrina wasn't done. She found me almost an hour later, out on the hotel terrace, where I'd gone to get some air away from the reception and the low hum of 200 people quietly discussing what they'd just witnessed. The terrace overlooked the 9th hole of the golf course attached to the venue. Dark now except for a string of cafe lights someone had hung along the railing for the reception, and I remember standing there for a while before she arrived, watching a sprinkler system click on in the distance, thinking about nothing in particular, grateful for a few minutes of quiet after the night I'd already had. Her composure was gone by then. Her voice had the sharp, unsteady edge of someone who'd been drinking wine since the ceremony started at 4 o'clock and hadn't eaten enough to absorb it. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, gripping the terrace railing with both hands. "Chasing after some woman half your age to embarrass me? She's 38, I said. I'm 51. That's not half my age, Sabrina, and you know it. You know what I mean. I don't, actually. Since when do you get an opinion on my life? You left me. You don't get to script what happens after." Her hands shook against the railing, the kind of shaking that comes from something deeper than anger, the kind that comes from watching a version of your life you'd carefully built start to wobble in front of the very people you built it for. "You're making a fool of yourself in front of everyone I know." "No," I said. "I'm finally done letting you make a fool of me." Her face crumpled, just for a second, into something almost honest, something I hadn't seen on her since before the divorce, maybe before Preston, maybe before any of it. And in that unguarded second, she said something I wasn't expecting. "Preston left me," she whispered, her voice suddenly small, sober-sounding in a way the wine hadn't allowed all night. "Everyone here knows it, and watching you maybe be happy again, it makes me feel like I threw away something good, chasing something shinier. For 3 years, I'd wondered what was underneath all her cruelty, all the little comments about settling and ambition, and a life she'd apparently found suffocating. Now, for a moment, I thought I finally had it. Not hatred, fear. She needed me broken so her choices made sense, so the last 3 years added up to something other than a mistake. "I don't need you broken, Sabrina," I said, more gently than I felt. "I never did. I just needed you to be honest with me, even once, somewhere in the last 3 years. That's all any of this ever needed to be." She wiped at her eyes, careful not to smear her makeup, a reflex so practiced it looked almost mechanical, even in the middle of what seemed like a real moment. "You always made honesty sound so simple," she said, "like it doesn't cost anything." "It doesn't have to cost as much as you think it does," I said. "It usually costs less than the alternative. You just have to be willing to pay it up front instead of later, with interest." She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "That's very you, turning my life into a lesson plan. Old habits," I said. For a moment standing there, I let myself believe we might actually land somewhere honest, some small, imperfect truce neither of us had managed during the divorce itself. I even reached out briefly and touched her arm, the way you'd touch an old friend who was hurting, forgetting for a second everything that had happened in that ballroom an hour earlier. I thought, standing there, that we might actually end the night somewhere close to peace. Two people who'd once built an entire life together finding some small, quiet truce on a hotel terrace after everything else had already gone wrong. It was a nice thought while it lasted. That's when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text message. From Georgia, of all people. Someone who'd barely spoken 2 full sentences to me since the divorce. Someone who I'd always suspected loved her sister more than she trusted her. I almost didn't check it. Sabrina was still talking, still trying to salvage the story she'd built about the two of us, about ambition and settling and a marriage she'd apparently spent 23 years quietly resenting. But something about the timing made my stomach turn cold. An instinct I couldn't name yet. The same quiet, wordless alarm I used to feel walking into the house on evenings when Sabrina had already decided, before I even opened the door, exactly how the conversation was going to go. I pulled out my phone and opened the message. It was a photo. Grainy, clearly taken in secret. The kind of angle you get when someone's shooting quickly from inside a parked car with the window cracked. The phone held low against the steering wheel. Time-stamped from earlier that same afternoon, 3 hours before the ceremony even started. Back when I was still at the hotel getting dressed and Sabrina was supposedly at the venue with the wedding coordinator handling last-minute details. Underneath the photo, a single line from Georgia. "She doesn't know I saw this. You need to see it before you give that woman your number." My thumb hovered over the image for a long second, the terrace noise fading into a dull roar behind me, Sabrina's voice still going, still performing wounded honesty for an audience of one, still building toward whatever she thought this conversation was supposed to accomplish. I looked up at her, mid-sentence, still talking about Preston and shiny things and choices she regretted. Then I looked back down at the photo Georgia had sent me, and I felt the ground shift under my dress shoes. Behind me, through the terrace doors, I could hear the band starting a slow song, the kind couples sway to without really dancing. And somewhere under that music, I could hear Julian's laugh, easy and unguarded, carrying across the ballroom the way it used to when he was small enough to still believe his parents had everything figured out. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should put the phone away, that whatever was in that image could wait until tomorrow, until after the cake and the bouquet toss and the last dance, until Julian and Priya were safely on their way to whatever hotel they'd booked for the night. But some instinct, the same instinct that had gone quiet in me for years and was only now, slowly, finally, starting to speak up again, told me that waiting had never once worked in my favor with Sabrina. Waiting was how $18,000 became $11,000 missing. Waiting was how a break became a lie that lasted 6 months in front of 200 people. I looked at Sabrina one more time, still talking, still unaware that the story she'd built was already unraveling in my hand, and I made the decision not to wait. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. The photo showed a parking lot I recognized immediately, the one behind the Fairwind, a boutique hotel 4 blocks from the wedding venue, the kind of place people book for exactly one reason. In the foreground, unmistakably, stood Sabrina, still in the pale blue dress she'd worn to the ceremony, her hair not yet fully styled, meaning this was taken before she'd gone to get ready with the bridal party. Standing across from her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, was Preston Yates. He had his hand on her arm. She wasn't pulling away. I zoomed in without meaning to, my thumb and finger spreading the image wider on the screen, some part of my brain still hoping I'd misread the angle, the lighting, the whole thing. But there was no misreading it. Preston Yates, the man Sabrina had told the entire ballroom left her 6 months ago, the man whose absence she'd used as a quiet, tragic footnote all night to explain her own bad behavior, was standing in a hotel parking lot with my ex-wife on the afternoon of our son's wedding, 3 hours before she stood up in front of 200 people and offered me around like unwanted furniture. "Daniel," Sabrina said, noticing I'd stopped listening, "are you even paying attention to me?" I didn't answer right away. I was scrolling, my hands steadier than they had any right to be, looking for the second message Georgia had sent, because there had to be more, because a single blurry photo of 2 people standing close together in a parking lot wasn't, on its own, proof of anything except bad optics. There was more. A second text came through as I stood there, Georgia typing furiously from wherever she was inside, watching her sister across the ballroom without Sabrina having any idea. "He's been staying at her apartment for 2 months. I found receipts in her purse from the Fairwind, 3 visits since March. She told me they were broken up. She told everyone they were broken up. I don't think that's true, Daniel." I read it twice. Then a third message, shorter, angrier, the kind of message that comes from someone who's been carrying a secret so long it started to feel like collusion. "There's also this. I found it in her email when I was helping her print the seating chart last week. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to snoop. It just came up." Attached was a screenshot, a forwarded email chain between Sabrina and someone at First Cascade Credit Union, dated 4 months ago, February. The subject line read, "Re-withdrawal authorization, Whitfield Cole Joint Custodial Account." I read the first line of the body text, my stomach tightening with every word. It referenced a withdrawal of $11,200 from an account I recognized immediately because I'd been putting money into it every month since Julian turned 10 years old. The account we'd built for his future. The one Sabrina told me back in the divorce mediation she'd continue managing responsibly. I stood on that terrace holding a phone with 3 messages on it that rewrote everything I thought I understood about the last 6 months, and possibly the last several years, while my ex-wife stood 2 feet away from me, still talking, still building her case for why I owed her some kind of grace tonight. I want to go back for a moment to what I hadn't put together yet, standing there, because the escalation that led to this moment had been happening in plain sight for months, and I'd missed almost all of it, the way you miss a slow leak in a tire until the morning it's suddenly flat. It started in January, 5 months before the wedding, when Sabrina called me out of nowhere, her voice warm in a way it hadn't been warm since before the divorce, and asked if we could put things aside for Julian's sake and present a united front for the wedding planning. I agreed because it seemed reasonable, because Julian deserved parents who could sit in the same room without tension. She invited me to a planning dinner in February at a restaurant downtown and spent most of the evening talking about how proud she was of how far she'd come since the divorce, how she'd learned so much about herself, how grateful she was that Preston had shown her what real partnership could look like, even though, she added, almost as an afterthought, they'd recently decided to take a break. A break, not a breakup. I remember noticing the word choice and letting it go, the way I let everything go. In March, Julian mentioned during a phone call I made to check in about the venue deposit that his mother had seemed stressed about money lately. He said it casually, the way 24-year-olds mention things they don't fully understand the weight of. I asked him to clarify. He said she'd mentioned needing to move some things around to help cover the wedding costs, since Priya's parents were paying for the venue and catering, but Sabrina had insisted on covering the band, the flowers, and the open bar, a commitment that, from what I understood of Sabrina's salary, seemed generous but not impossible. I offered to contribute. She declined, firmly, telling Julian she had it handled and didn't need my help. In April, at Julian's engagement party, hosted at Georgia's house in Salem, I noticed Sabrina take 3 separate phone calls during the 2-hour event, stepping outside each time, her voice dropping the moment she thought no one was watching. Georgia mentioned to me quietly, refilling my drink in the kitchen, that Sabrina had been under a lot of pressure lately, and asked me, almost pleadingly, to be patient with her sister during the wedding season. I didn't ask what kind of pressure. I should have. In May, 3 weeks before the wedding, Sabrina called me directly, the first time she'd called instead of texted since the divorce, and asked if I'd be willing to increase my contribution to what remained of Julian's fund, framing it as a way to make sure he and Priya had a real cushion for their first year of marriage. I agreed to send an additional $2,000, which I did, without asking a single question about what had happened to the $18,000 we'd built together over 14 years, because asking felt, at the time, like reopening old wounds neither of us needed reopened 3 weeks before our son's wedding. Each time, I told myself I was being reasonable. Each time, the request seemed small enough on its own, easy enough to justify, right up until the next one arrived, and the ceiling I thought I'd found turned out to be another floor. I think about a phone call I had with Sabrina in early June, 12 days before the wedding, that I've replayed more times than almost any other conversation from that whole stretch. She called to go over logistics, seating charts, timing for the rehearsal dinner, the kind of practical call that had become almost routine between us by then. Near the end, she brought up Preston unprompted, telling me she'd run into him at a grocery store the week before, and that it had been surprisingly civil, that she thought they might actually be able to be friends someday, given enough time and distance. I remember feeling at the time a small flicker of relief on her behalf, thinking that maybe she really had moved past it, that the version of her healing she'd been describing at dinners and engagement parties for months was finally starting to be true. I told her I was glad to hear it. She thanked me, her voice warm, grateful, entirely convincing. I didn't know yet that the grocery store story was, at best, a significant understatement of a relationship that had never actually paused, and at worst, something closer to a rehearsed line, the kind you practice saying out loud until it starts to sound true even to yourself. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, Julian called me late one night, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. He told me his mother had asked him, apparently in tears, whether he'd be willing to have a quiet conversation with Priya's parents about adjusting expectations for the open bar and flowers because she'd run into an unexpected shortfall. Julian, generous and trusting the way 24-year-olds often are with the people who raised them, had told her not to worry, that he'd figure something out, that they'd cut costs somewhere else in the budget. He asked me, hesitantly, if I could help cover the difference. I said yes immediately, because it was Julian, because it was his wedding, and because some old habit in me still wanted, more than anything, to be the reasonable one in every room Sabrina and I occupied together. Somewhere between the May phone call and the coffee meeting 10 days before the wedding, there was a moment I nearly caught the whole thing, and let it slip past me anyway. Julian mentioned, during a Sunday call in late May, that his mother had asked him not to mention to me that Preston had helped move some furniture into her apartment temporarily while his own place was getting renovated. Julian relayed it the way sons relay small domestic details, without weight, without suspicion, just background noise in a conversation mostly about groomsmen tuxedo fittings. I remember pausing on that detail for exactly as long as it takes to notice something is slightly wrong, and then letting it go. The same reflex I'd trained into myself for over 2 decades. A man doesn't move his furniture into an ex-girlfriend's apartment for a renovation that conveniently never seems to finish. I knew that, somewhere underneath the part of me that wanted peace more than truth. I chose not to know it out loud. There was one more step in that escalation I hadn't fully weighed at the time, one I only understood in hindsight. Standing on the terrace with George's messages lighting up my screen. 10 days before the wedding, Sabrina asked me to meet her for coffee near the school district office, telling me she wanted to clear the air before the big day so we could both show up as a united front for Julian. I went, cautiously optimistic, the way I always seemed to be with her, some stubborn part of me still hoping we could manage a friendship out of the wreckage of a marriage. She spent most of that meeting apologizing, in vague, sweeping terms, for how things had gone over the past few years, telling me she'd been doing a lot of reflecting, that she hoped I knew none of it had been personal. It felt, at the time, like an olive branch. It felt, looking back, like a woman rehearsing a version of remorse she needed me to believe, so that whatever came next, whatever she was still building toward with Preston, and the money and the story she planned to tell 200 guests, would land on softer ground. Near the end of that coffee, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned she'd been keeping some things private lately for her own peace of mind, and asked me not to take it personally if she seemed distant leading up to the wedding. I told her I understood. I didn't understand anything. I just didn't know yet what I wasn't understanding. What none of us knew yet, what I wouldn't understand until that terrace, phone in hand, 3 messages deep into George's confession, was that the shortfall Sabrina described to Julian wasn't a shortfall in the wedding budget at all. It was a shortfall created months earlier, when $11,200 disappeared from the account meant for our son's future, withdrawn in February, the same month Sabrina had told me over dinner that she and Preston had decided to take a break. I remembered, standing there, a small detail from that February dinner that I'd dismissed as nothing at the time. Sabrina had mentioned, almost in passing, that Preston's contracting business had hit a rough patch after losing a major district bid, and that she felt terrible for him, watching someone she cared about struggle like that. I remember thinking it was strange that she'd feel that responsible for a man she claimed to be taking a break from. I remember letting it go, the way I always let things go, because pushing back on Sabrina had, over 23 years and then 3 more years of divorce, come to feel like more trouble than it was worth. Standing on that terrace, all of it clicked into a shape I hadn't let myself see before. Preston hadn't left her in December, or if he had, it hadn't lasted. She'd used his absence, real or invented, as a story to explain her own unhappiness at Julian's wedding. A story that let her stand in that ballroom and mock my quiet, settled life while secretly still tangled up with the man whose shortfall had drained our son's future by $11,000. Money she then quietly recovered piece by guilting Julian and me into replacing it 3 weeks before his wedding. "Daniel," Sabrina said again, sharper this time, noticing the color drain from my face. "What is that? What are you looking at?" I turned the phone toward her, screen still lit, the parking lot photo still open. I watched her face do something I'd never seen it do in 23 years of marriage and 3 years of divorce. It went completely, utterly still, the practiced brightness draining out of it all at once, like a held breath finally released. "Where did you get that?" she said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, almost mechanical. "Georgia," I said. "She's been carrying it around for a while, apparently. Longer than either of us knew." Sabrina's eyes flicked toward the ballroom doors, searching, I assumed, for her sister, and I watched something like betrayal flash across her face, as if Georgia's honesty was the crime here and not whatever the photo actually documented. "That doesn't mean what you think it means," she said, her voice climbing back toward its terrace volume, the one that had drawn a few curious glances from smokers near the far railing. "Preston and I are figuring things out. That's private. That's not something you get to weaponize at your son's wedding." "I'm not the one who weaponized anything tonight," I said. "You stood up in front of 200 people and offered me around like I was something you'd outgrown. And the whole time, you were still seeing the man you told everyone left you, and you were still moving money out of an account that belonged to our son, to cover for him. You don't know anything about that account," she snapped, but her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence, the first real crack I'd heard all night. "I know I put $400 into it every month for 14 years, I said. "I know it had $18,000 in it 3 years ago. I know Julian told me you were stressed about money in March, and I know you asked me for $2,000 more in May, and I know First Cascade Credit Union sent you an email in February about an $11,000 withdrawal. That's not nothing, Sabrina. That's the whole picture." She opened her mouth, and for a moment I thought she might actually try to explain it, might finally, after 3 years, tell me something true. Instead, her face hardened into something I recognized from 100 old arguments, the particular defensive posture she used whenever a conversation moved somewhere she couldn't control. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, "to watch your whole life get smaller and smaller while everyone tells you to be grateful for it. Preston made me feel like I mattered again, like I was still someone worth paying attention to. So yes, when he needed help, I helped him. That's not a crime, Daniel. That's what people who love each other do. With our son's money," I said, without telling anyone, while letting Julian believe there was some innocent shortfall he needed to fix by asking his own father for more. The terrace had gone quiet around us in a way that meant people were listening now, not just the smokers by the railing, but a small cluster near the doorway, drawn by the rising tension the way people are always drawn to the edges of an argument they're not part of. Isabel appeared in the doorway at some point during this, though I hadn't noticed her arrive, standing just behind Georgia, who'd finally worked up the nerve to follow her own confession outside and face what she'd started. "Sabrina," Georgia said quietly, stepping forward. "I couldn't keep carrying this. Not after tonight, not after what you did to him in there." Sabrina spun toward her sister, and for a moment the fear I'd glimpsed earlier, the raw, honest fear underneath all her cruelty, resurfaced. Except now it had nowhere left to hide behind. "You went through my email," she said. "You had no right." "I had every right," Georgia said, her voice shaking but steady. "You asked me to help print the seating chart, and I found a withdrawal notice for $11,000 from Julian's account. And then I find out you told everyone Preston left you in December when he's been staying at your apartment since April. I've been lying for you for months, Sabrina. I'm done." A small crowd had gathered by then, close enough to hear most of it, far enough to pretend they weren't listening. I saw Priya's mother near the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone raised to never show her hand in public. I saw Julian's college roommate, Marcus, standing near the railing with his phone lowered, clearly having stopped filming whatever toast footage he'd been capturing earlier. And then I saw Julian himself, still in his tuxedo jacket, tie loosened, pushing through the small crowd with Priya close behind him, both of them clearly having been pulled out of the reception by someone who'd noticed the terrace situation escalating. "What is going on?" Julian said, looking between his mother, his aunt, and me, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a groom who'd hoped, foolishly, that his wedding day might be the one day his parents managed to behave. I looked at my son, 24 years old, married 3 hours earlier, standing on a hotel terrace at nearly 11 at night because his mother's carefully constructed story had finally caught up with her. I thought about every reasonable request I'd said yes to over the past 5 months, every small ceiling that turned out to be a floor, every time I told myself I was being the mature one, the calm one, the one who didn't make scenes. I thought about the fact that I'd sent $2,000 in May to cover a shortfall that had never really existed, not the way I'd been told it existed. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "I think your mother owes you an explanation about where some of your wedding fund actually went." "Daniel, don't," Sabrina said, her voice dropping into something almost pleading now, all the earlier sharpness gone. "Not here, not tonight." "You didn't think twice about doing this to me in front of 200 people an hour ago," I said. "I think Julian deserves the truth in front of considerably fewer." Julian's eyes moved from me to his mother, and I watched something shift in his face, the particular dawning look of a person realizing a story they'd they'd trusted completely, has holes in it they never noticed before. What is he talking about, Mom? He said quietly. Sabrina didn't answer right away. She looked at Georgia, at me, at the small ring of guests still hovering near the doorway, at her son standing in front of her in his wedding tuxedo waiting for an answer, and something in her seemed to collapse inward, the performance finally running out of road. I needed to help Preston with something, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Business trouble. I told myself I'd pay it back before anyone noticed. I didn't think it would take this long. With my money, Julian said. The account Dad's been putting money into since I was 10. Our money, Sabrina said, though even she seemed to hear how weak it sounded. I was going to fix it by asking me and Dad to replace it, Julian said, without telling either of us what actually happened to it. Priya, standing quietly beside her new husband, reached over and took his hand, and I watched Julian hold on to it like it was the only steady thing left on that terrace. I want to be honest about the several hours that followed, because they weren't clean and they weren't dignified, and nothing about a wedding reception unraveling in real time in front of 200 guests ever really is. Word traveled through the ballroom in the particular quiet, electric way. Bad news travels at a formal event, through murmurs at tables and quick glances and phones tilted discreetly toward each other under the tablecloths. By the time the cake had been cut, an event that happened almost mechanically, with Julian and Priya smiling through it because the photographer was still there, and some part of every wedding has to keep moving forward, regardless of what's happening underneath it. Most of the room understood, in broad strokes if not in detail, that something significant had cracked open on that terrace. Sabrina spent the next hour trying to manage the fallout the only way she knew how, moving from table to table, offering variations of the same explanation, that things had been complicated, that Preston had needed help, that she'd intended to handle it privately before the wedding brought everything to the surface. Some guests were kind to her, or at least polite, the way people are polite to someone visibly unraveling in public. Others weren't. I watched a woman I recognized as one of Sabrina's former colleagues from the school district quietly gather her coat and leave without saying goodbye to anyone. A small, unmistakable statement. Georgia sat with me for a while at the edge of the dance floor, her hands still shaking slightly, apologizing for waiting so long to say anything. I kept thinking I was wrong, she said. I kept thinking there was some explanation that made it okay. But watching her do that to you in there, in front of everyone, I couldn't protect her anymore. Not after that. I told her she didn't owe me an apology, that she'd done something difficult and necessary, and that Julian would need her more than ever in the coming weeks. I meant it. Georgia became, in the space of a single terrible night, someone I understood I could actually trust, after years of assuming she'd always side with her sister no matter what. Julian and Priya spent almost 45 minutes in a side room off the ballroom with the wedding coordinator, working through what they wanted to do about the remaining reception, whether to continue as planned or cut the night short. They chose, in the end, to finish the wedding, because Priya's parents had traveled from Chicago and half the guests had flown in from out of state, and because, as Julian told me later, quietly, near the coat check, I'm not going to let her ruin this on top of everything else. I was proud of him for that decision in a way that surprised me, a specific, clear-eyed pride I hadn't expected to feel on a night that had gone so wrong so quickly. There were unexpected allies scattered through that ballroom, people I hadn't anticipated. Priya's father, Anil, found me near the bar around 11:30 and told me quietly that he'd sensed something off about Sabrina's version of events all through the engagement, though he'd never said anything because it wasn't his place. He shook my hand and told me Julian had spoken highly of me for years, that whatever had happened in my marriage clearly hadn't diminished the man I'd raised, and that meant something to him as a father giving his daughter away into this family. It was a small kindness, but it landed hard, the way small kindnesses do on nights when you feel like you're standing in wreckage. Sabrina made a few desperate final moves before the night ended. Around midnight, she cornered Isabel near the coat check and tried, from what Isabel told me afterward, to convince her that I was not who he seems, that I'd been controlling during our marriage, that Isabel should be careful getting involved with a man who'd clearly, in Sabrina's telling, driven his own wife into someone else's arms through years of neglect. Isabel listened, according to her, with the calm professional patience she'd developed working 12 years in an emergency room, and then told Sabrina, plainly, that she'd watched the entire night unfold with her own eyes and didn't need anyone's narration to understand what she'd seen. Around 12:15, Sabrina tried Julian one more time, catching him near the exit as the last guests were filtering out, asking him, according to Priya, whether he could keep this between family and not let it define his wedding day. Julian told her, gently but firmly, that it already had, and that the conversation about the money wasn't over, but it also wasn't going to happen tonight. There was a moment, close to 12:30, when the venue staff had started stacking chairs and the band had packed up, when I found myself alone with Sabrina near the terrace doors one last time, both of us worn down past the point of performance. She looked older than she had at the start of the night. The makeup faded, the confidence gone, just a 50-year-old woman standing in the wreckage of a story she'd told herself for months. I did love you, she said, not looking at me, looking instead at the dark shape of the golf course beyond the terrace railing. I know that's hard to believe right now, but I did. I just wanted more than what we had, and I convinced myself wanting more meant something was wrong with the life we built instead of something being wrong with me. I didn't say anything for a while. I thought about 23 years of marriage, about Julian's childhood in that little house on Ashgrove Lane, about the woman who used to laugh so hard at her own jokes that she'd snort, back before Ambition and Preston Yates and $11,000 became the story of us. I felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anger either. Grief, maybe. The specific, quiet grief of mourning, something that was never coming back. Not because it ended badly, though it had, but because it was never going to be what I'd once believed it was. I believe you loved me, in whatever way you were capable of at the time, I said finally. But loving someone doesn't give you the right to humiliate them in front of 200 people, or take money from your son to cover for a man you were still involved with. Those are two different things, Sabrina. I hope you figure out the difference eventually. She didn't answer. I think by that point, there wasn't much left to say. The weeks after the wedding brought a slower, quieter kind of chaos, the logistical and legal aftermath of a night that had blown apart in front of 200 witnesses. Julian consulted a family friend who practiced law in Portland about whether the withdrawal from the custodial account constituted something actionable, since the account, while informally understood as Julian's future fund, had technically remained in Sabrina's name after the divorce settlement. The lawyer's answer was complicated, the kind of answer lawyers give when the truth is messier than a simple yes or no. Sabrina had broad legal authority over the account. Morally, everyone agreed, what she'd done was indefensible. Legally, pursuing it would mean months of family court proceedings that Julian, 3 weeks married, didn't have the appetite for. In the end, Sabrina agreed, under pressure from Georgia, and I suspect her own dawning understanding of how much she'd damaged her relationship with her son, to repay the $11,200 over 18 months, transferring installments directly into a new account Julian opened in his own name. She made the first payment in July, on time, and I found myself hoping, despite everything, that she'd follow through on the rest, not for my sake, but for Julian's, because he deserved to trust his mother again someday, even in some small rebuilt way. There was a smaller, quieter complication that surfaced in August, one that took another 2 months to fully sort out. When Julian went to open the new account for his mother's repayments, the bank flagged an old authorization form, still on file from when he'd turned 18, that technically gave Sabrina co-signing rights on a separate, smaller account I hadn't even remembered existed, a leftover from a summer job Julian had held in high school, one we'd set up together to teach him about saving. It only had about $400 in it, untouched for years, but finding it forced Julian to spend an afternoon at the credit union closing out every account his mother's name still appeared on, a small, tedious kind of grief in its own right, severing financial ties one signature at a time. He told me afterward it felt less like paperwork and more like a divorce of his own, a formal, documented ending to an old kind of trust that had already ended in every way that mattered on that terrace. Preston, as it turned out, hadn't just been staying at Sabrina's apartment since April. Georgia later told me in one of the long conversations we started having over coffee in the weeks after the wedding that Preston had lost his business almost entirely by June, that the shortfall Sabrina had covered in February hadn't been enough to save it, and that he'd moved back in with Sabrina not out of love, but out of necessity, with nowhere else to go. Whatever story Sabrina had told herself about romance and choosing him over her stable, settled life had, by the time of the wedding, curdled into something closer to obligation and exhaustion, though she hadn't been ready to admit that to anyone, including herself. I felt, in the weeks that followed, a strange, unexpected sympathy for her underneath the anger, the kind of sympathy you feel for someone who's built a version of their own life so elaborate they've trapped themselves inside it. She'd wanted so badly to prove that leaving me had been the beginning of something better, that when the evidence started contradicting the story, she chose to protect the story instead of the people around her. I understood that impulse, even as I couldn't excuse what it had cost Julian, and what it had cost me, standing in front of 200 people while she performed a version of freedom she didn't actually have. There was a quiet grief in all of it that took me longer to process than the anger did. Sitting alone in my apartment on Ashgrove Lane, a few weeks after the wedding, I found an old photo album Sabrina and I had put together when Julian was small, full of pictures from the house with the crooked chimney, birthday parties in the backyard, Julian's first day of kindergarten with a backpack twice the size of him. I sat with that album for almost an hour, not crying exactly, but close to it, mourning not the marriage as it had actually become in its final years, but the marriage as I'd once believed it was, the one where the woman I loved was exactly who she said she was. That version of Sabrina, the one who used to snort laugh at her own jokes, had been gone a long time before the divorce ever happened. I just hadn't let myself see it. Isabel and I started seeing each other properly in July, slowly, without any of the urgency the ballroom moment might have suggested. Our first real date was low-key, dinner at a small Thai place near her apartment in Northwest Portland. No wedding drama, no audience, just two people talking for 3 hours about work and books, and the particular loneliness of the years each of us had spent settling for less than we deserved without quite realizing it. She told me that night that she'd noticed something in me at the wedding beyond just the humiliation Sabrina had put me through, something steady underneath it, and that steadiness was rarer than people gave it credit for. Julian and Priya settled into married life in a rented townhouse near Beaverton, close enough that Julian and I started having a standing Sunday dinner together, something we hadn't done regularly since before the divorce. He told me over dinner in August that the whole wedding disaster had, in a strange way, brought us press closer, that watching me refuse to shrink in front of 200 people had taught him something about the kind of man he wanted to be in his own marriage. Steady instead of loud, honest instead of performative. I think about that ballroom often, the moment Sabrina tried to hand me off like something no longer wanted, and the moment Isabel refused to let the room laugh along with her. I think about how close I came to sitting quietly at table 6 and absorbing that humiliation the way I'd absorbed almost everything for 23 years and 3 more after that, telling myself it was easier than making a scene. I think about what it cost me, all those years of letting things go, and what it finally cost Sabrina, the story she'd built collapsing in front of the 200 people she'd wanted so badly to convince. These days my life looks quieter than it did during the marriage, and quieter too than the version of my life Sabrina used to describe as settling. I still teach at Lincoln High School. I still coach the debate team every spring. Isabel and I have been together for over a year now, unhurried, steady, the kind of relationship where nobody needs to perform anything for an audience. Julian calls most Sundays, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask advice about married life that I try to give honestly, without pretending my own marriage was ever the model he should follow. Sabrina and I speak occasionally, mostly about Julian, mostly civil, though something essential broke on that terrace that I don't think either of us expects to fully repair. She finished repaying the account in December on schedule, and Julian told me she'd started seeing a therapist, which I hope helps her, genuinely, even after everything. What I understand now, that I didn't understand standing at table 6 with 200 people watching my ex-wife offer me around like something discarded, is that the humiliation she was trying to hand me that night was never really about me at all. It was about a story she needed to be true, badly enough that she was willing to sacrifice her own son's trust, her sister's loyalty, and whatever was left of her dignity to keep it standing a little longer. I was never the punchline she wanted me to be. I was just the only person in that room quiet enough, patient enough, and finally, that night, done enough with staying quiet to let the truth stand up on its own. There's something a little sad in all of it still, even now, even with Isabel beside me and Julian happy and Sabrina slowly rebuilding whatever she has left. Something real was lost that night on that terrace. A version of a family that might have aged together differently, a version of Sabrina I'd loved once and mourned quietly in an old photo album alone in my apartment. I don't think that sadness ever fully goes away, and I've stopped expecting it to. But I don't carry it the way I used to carry her disappointment, like something I owed her. I carry it now the way you carry any loss that taught you something true about yourself, gently, and a little wiser for it. 200 guests watched my ex-wife try to give me away that night, like something nobody wanted anymore. What none of us knew yet, standing in that ballroom, was that by the time the night ended, it wouldn't be me anyone remembered as discarded. It would be the story she'd spent 6 months building, coming apart in front of the very people she'd built it for.